Hi, I need this for my review. Thanks.
Hello everybody, welcome to Comic Tropes. I'm your host Chris, and all this month I've got a theme going on. I'm looking at either horror comics or at least a comic with some sort of monster character. I think that this comic that I'm about to review fits with both of those. It's one of my personal favorites, Mike Mignola's Hellboy. Mike Mignola broke into the industry in the 80s. By the mid-80s, he was bouncing back and forth between Marvel and DC, the big two. But he really made his mark in 1994 when he released his creator-owned title Hellboy through Dark Horse Comics. And wow, what an interesting blend of styles. I've heard Mignola's work described as a mix of Jack Kirby and H.P. Lovecraft, and that works, but I don't know if it does it all the justice that it could do it. I want to take a look at one of his stories called The Corpse. And this was a one-shot, normal comic book length, but it was delivered in 2-page installments for Capital City's Advance Comics. So over the course of 8 issues, there were all these 2 pages, and then he tacked on a little more to sort of make it a complete issue that he released in an anthology of shorter Hellboy one-shots and stories. I think it's going to be a great story to take a look at, to really examine his techniques, both in how he approaches the writing and his very unique, eye-catching, mind-blowing artwork. So without any further ado, let's read The Corpse. The story's first page has 2 panels of artwork, a title, and a short poem. In the first panel, we see some odd old men in shadow creeping around outside at night. The title, of course, is The Corpse, and we see some sort of dead body. Hopefully it's recently dead. It doesn't look like a skeleton, so I guess it's somewhat recently dead. And then some sort of a demon figure in the darkness. Now what's interesting about this is it's one of the tropes we're going to examine. Negative space is a technique that Mignola uses perhaps more than any other currently working comic book artist. It's his approach to a composition where he'll throw down a lot of heavy blacks, he'll throw in some characters or a setting, but sometimes that's not so important as the overall idea that it evokes, the overall layout, the composition, the form, and the structure. Mignola uses negative space to really draw our eye in and keep it sort of moving in maybe a circular motion. Sometimes on the show, I like to do something to mark every trope we come across. This week, I'm going to take a drink of Bloody Mary, red for Hellboy, out of this Mignola-esque skull glass. Cheers. The story proper begins in a modest cottage out in Ireland in 1959. A mother is pleading to no one in particular to please bring her baby back. And yet, we can see that there is a baby in a crib right behind her. Her husband comes home and he's brought help. At first he looks intimidating, but they get over that pretty quickly. This is Hellboy, and he's a paranormal investigator. Establishing shots can be so important, not just to getting the reader up to speed with who is involved, when does it take place, etc., but setting a mood. And I think that Mignola is absolutely one of the best at setting a mood with a lot of his establishing shots. We see Gothic castles or, eerie broken down chapels, but it's just amazing how well he can set a scene and evoke a mood with just a single, well-detailed panel. This is no exception. It takes place in 1959. Worth noting that while a lot of Hellboy's stories take place in the present, he himself was brought into our world back during World War II. Some Nazis were performing an occult ritual and they summoned forth this baby demon, but he was rescued by the Americans and he was raised to be a good guy, and he works for us as a paranormal detective. Here's an establishing shot. Hellboy approaches the baby, talking to it gently and saying, "I've got something for you. What a baby's like. Baby's like iron." I'm found out! And with that, the baby is revealed to be something other than human. Hellboy grabs it with a nearby pair of tongs from the fireplace, picks it up, and we can see its face change to something that looks goblin-esque. That's an existing myth, that of the changeling. Hellboy comics use a lot of existing mythologies from all sorts of cultures. And in this case, the changeling is an old English myth of a fairy coming along and stealing away somebody's baby and replacing it with a doppelganger, a look-alike. So it was just something to sort of probably explain when a parent felt that their baby wasn't quite right. Well, they just created their own sort of version of what was going on there. It wasn't anything to do with psychology. They came up with the idea of fairies. I'm going to change from sober to slightly buzzed. It's not the heat of the tongs that bothers the fairy, but instead the magical properties of iron, which are sort of like a type of poison to a lot of magical creatures. The fairy demands to be released and howls in pain, but Hellboy refuses to let go until he reveals what happened to the baby. Eventually the fairy talks, saying, "Have mercy on my poor withered form! Get thee to the crossroads by the strike of middle night, under the corpse tree. Look you for 3 rough men, little men, and do as they bid. I can say no more." And with that, Hellboy tosses the fairy into the furnace to slow him down. Let's back up to that first establishing panel on this page and take a real close look at how Mignola approaches drawing Hellboy. There's obviously a lot of shadow there, but there's a very specific technique at play. Chiaroscuro. That is an Italian word which basically translates to light and dark. And what's interesting is a lot of people, when they ink comics, use techniques like cross-hatching and feathering. Mignola doesn't really use that too much. Instead, he deals with very deep, heavy shadows. And he uses that play between light and dark to more suggest a form as compared to presenting it in a realistic manner. It's stylized, but it isn't necessarily overly cartoony. There's still a depth to those shadows. It's just that he uses them in a very particular way. I happen to really like it. I also happen to enjoy a drink. Hellboy follows the fairy's instructions, and this isn't a trope, but let's really look at these next 5 panels. There is a school of thought that you can't properly do horror in comics, and the argument is that you can't surprise the reader with, a pop-up scare of any kind. To a degree, that's true. The best you can possibly do is put a reveal on the following page, and it can't be on the odd side page. It has to be on the even side so that when you flip the page, you've got a reveal. But that isn't the same effect as what you can get in film and TV when you're playing with time and you control that time. Nevertheless, I think that you can do horror in comics in somewhat the same way you can with prose. It's all about setting the scene, evoking a mood, and doing what you can to control the pacing. And I think the pacing in these 5 panels is masterful. Let's take another look. Our protagonist stands under the hanging tree. We hear a creak, we see a watch tick, we see him look, and suddenly a corpse is just there. It's obviously some form of a ghost. And yeah, you can glance at that and know that that corpse is there. However, if you actually respect the panels to sort of represent time passing, and you look at each panel, I think that the eye is guided and timed such that it is a good reveal. And on top of that, we have the actual hanging rope in roughly the same position from left to right in 3 consecutive panels, and suddenly there's a full body in the 3rd panel where there was not one before. Me talking about that in an actual video, it may not be doing it the amount of justice that you actually get if you literally read that page of a comic book. I find it a fantastic representation of pacing. I just absolutely love this particular page. The hanged man points the way, Hellboy follows it, and he meets three gentlemen at a crossroads who are carrying a corpse. The men give Hellboy a mission. Hellboy must bury this corpse before the break of dawn. If he does, he'll get the baby back. But if he doesn't, the child is lost forever. And with that, they tell him 4 nearby burial sites that he can try to bury it in. This general idea is also an existing myth. It's a very old Irish myth, the myth of Teague O'Kane. And to put it very simply, Teague was a womanizer and lazy, and he lived off of his father's money. He just was a really bad guy, slept with prostitutes, etc. And one night he finds himself cursed to bury a corpse before the break of dawn. And he checks the first place and the skeletons tell him it's full, and he checks the next place and the ghosts tell him that it's full, and he's finally able to bury the corpse at the final site just before the break of dawn, and it makes him change his ways, and he marries the last prostitute he was with, and his father's like, "You can have my inheritance. I was going to give it to your cousin, but you've changed your ways." So kind of in a way, that moral at the end just does not feel earned at all. But it is an interesting mythology that Mike Mignola discovered and found a way to use within the context of Hellboy. The next several pages of this story follow that myth very closely, with Hellboy trying 3 different burial sites and finding no success at any of them. At the first one, he's turned away by a bunch of ghost knights. At the next one, there are burning ghosts that tell him that there's no room. And finally, he ends up at a site where something invisible just keeps punching him, and he can't fight it. Between the second and third sites, they encounter something strange, a rock just thumping up and down. When they look, there's a pot of gold underneath. The corpse starts yelling at Hellboy, "Get down in there, boy! Fetch me that gold! You can do it! You're big, but you're fast! Fast!" And Hellboy says, "Let me ask you something. Given your present condition, what the hell do you need gold for?" I'd love to go into each page in more detail, going over why I love the art, but it would be repetitive. However, we have hit 2 tropes. We've got the black humor that will frequently show up in Hellboy comics, gives Hellboy some personality. And then we've got several visual elements that show up in a lot of Mike Mignola comics, not just Hellboy, but certainly in Hellboy. We've got skeletons, chapels, and graves. You can see that in so much of his work. Glug, glug, glug. While Hellboy is getting punched by something invisible, that changeling fairy, whose name is Graugach, is jumping around through the forest. He's got a magical key, and he gives it to someone that he calls Jenny Greenteeth. He tells her to go down to the bottom of the lake and wake something up. Jenny Greenteeth is a real myth. It's one where parents would warn their children not to go around certain lakes because they were afraid that Jenny Greenteeth would reach up and drag them to the bottom and drown them. It was frequently a term that they would use around ponds and lakes that have that, I think it's called gillyweed, but you know, those sort of lily pads and weeds that you can actually get like caught up in really, really badly. So people could drown in that stuff, and I think it just sort of evolved into a myth that there was sort of a monstrous lady in the lake that wanted to pull people down. It's actually a myth that shows up in a lot of different cultures under different names, but the English and Irish version is Jenny Greenteeth. After these drinks, I'm going to be Chris Redteeth. Hellboy takes the corpse to the final burial site option, saying, "This is it. This or nothing. So it's this, no matter what." But just as Hellboy crosses a small bridge over water to the burial site, a gigantic boar beast jumps out of the water, saying, "Yahaha! Where's your iron now, Hellboy? Ah, jeez." Graugach shows up and says, "Behold, free at last! Grom, war monster!" And as Graugach talks about how great Grom is, Grom just picks him up and eats him. Grom is absolutely a Kirby-esque monster. I think it's pretty clear that Mike Mignola likes Kirby's work. especially with how he draws certain things, body proportions, making people really big and beefy, really strong brow lines, the way he illustrates monsters, it'll really remind you of stuff like the monsters from Apocalypse in DC Comics, things like that, or The Thing from Fantastic Four. There's no question that Hellboy and his enemies are very reminiscent of that style. It's kind of nice to see that kind of respect still existing in today's day and age. And I'll respect this going down my throat. Grom beats on Hellboy, but Hellboy has many magical items in his possession. One of them is some sort of a locket, and Grom is weak to that magic. Hellboy beats Grom away and runs with the corpse, saying, "Sun's coming up. No time, no time." Well, that's handy. Dream logic. Hellboy running around a corner at the last moment only to find a pre-dug grave ready for that corpse doesn't necessarily make too much sense. It makes a type of supernatural magical sense. It's a type of dream logic that Hellboy comics frequently employ. I think that it may come from a line by H.P. Lovecraft in which he said about writing, "In all things mysterious, never explain." It was a line that Stanley Kubrick, the famous director, took to heart and used in his filmmaking. And I think Mike Mignola is using that line as well. I think that he's very influenced by H.P. Lovecraft because some of the enemies that Hellboy will fight are elder gods that existed, before time and before space. They live in a dark place and exist only to create chaos. They're tentacled, gigantic beasts that you can't understand or comprehend. It'll drive you mad to see their form. That's almost literally H.P. Lovecraft stuff, but it exists in Hellboy as well. We've almost finished the story. I've almost finished this drink. Just in the nick of time, Hellboy finishes burying the corpse. An elder fairy pops up and Hellboy says, "Guess you owe me a baby." To which the fairy replies that they would have raised the child as one of their own. No harm would have ever come to her. "Sure, why should she be a person when she could live under a log with you guys?" Unkind. Then the fairy explains that they just aren't having babies anymore, so they needed to steal this child to try to live on. But Hellboy doesn't actually have much sympathy for the monster, and he says that the baby belongs with her parents. Just to be on the safe side, he taps it with iron, and he says, "You're okay. I think somebody's going to be happy to see you." You're real. Hellboy is an interesting character. He's inherently got some conflict within him because he is a monster and yet his job is fighting monsters. If anything, he wishes he could be more human. It's sort of how he was raised, and it reminds me in some ways of Superman. Superman is an alien, technically, and yet in many ways he's the most human of us all because of his amazing moral compass and his incredible passion. That's what keeps him from being scary. He's got godlike powers. Hellboy would be really scary if he meant harm to humanity. But it's that empathy at the core that makes them heroic and likable and admirable. Anyway, I could go on and on about Mike Mignola's artwork and even his writing forever. I love that stuff. I love Hellboy. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It has a definitive conclusion. Now, there are still some Hellboy one-shots and stories that take place sort of in that middle time frame. Sometimes the stories will jump around in time to just examine different mythologies from around the world. But anyway, the central story of Hellboy, all written and illustrated by Mike Mignola, it's got a beginning, middle, end. So it's a really cool experience. I recommend it strongly. One of my favorite monsters. I think you could call it a horror comic most of the time, and I just love it. I appreciate you bearing with me. Until next week, keep reading comics, and if you're still watching this, and nobody ever really watches this far, a few dedicated people do, but please keep in mind that I do have a Patreon page, so if you're up for supporting me, just like $1 or $2 a month, that means a lot to me. I'm still technically losing money on this whole endeavor. I don't care too much. but I would love to get it to a place where I'm turning a small profit, because I do have bigger ideas for what I would like to do with the show. Anyway, if you go to Patreon, I have various things there. I'll write up blogs about what's coming up and what's going on in my life. When I can, I'll put up exclusive episodes for a while, or put an episode up early. So I try to put some of that stuff in there. Sometimes I'll put a poll where you can vote on what you'd be interested in seeing in the future. And now there's a bug flying around. So I guess that's as good an excuse as any to say, I'm done, I'm calling it a night. Thanks for watching.